Greetings, fellow tarot travelers. Tripping through the tetrahedral triptych of cards I shall now lay before you. I'm Tarot Torch, and now we're going to talk about Venezuela. I have two other videos on this topic of Venezuela, but things are happening so quickly in that small, poor country that's so oil-rich. It's time we address it one more time. If you looked at Venezuela too, you'll know the cards are really, really bad right now for Venezuela, and I'm hoping today's reading will show a little bit more hope. Venezuela is reported to have sent long convoys of troops and howitzer tanks on their public highways to the Venezuelan border with Colombia. NATO, the EU, Israel, Brazil, and the US all now support the ascent of Juan Guaido, an American-educated politician, as the self-proclaimed president of Venezuela. Juan Guaido has sworn himself in as president and is the self-anointed head of that government by public proclamation and rally attendance alone. These public gatherings supporting Guaido are small compared to Maduro's rallies and are called astroturfing by political analysts who are comparing it to a grassroots movement. Nicolas Maduro is not stepping down from this Western imperialist coup, and troops and tanks were sent to locations where the socialist president of Venezuela, Nicolas Maduro, anticipates a US-backed invasion of his country. Mike Pompeo urged the Venezuelan government and army not to attack Juan Guaido or his followers at risk of an American retaliatory attack or invasion. The Venezuelan government has given 72 hours for all U.S. diplomats to leave, thus breaking off all diplomatic and political relations with the U.S. John Bolton said Monday that the U.S. will indeed slap new stiff oil sanctions on Venezuela, which includes blockaded assets and blocked oil exports, which Maduro claims is nothing less than trying to steal Citgo, the nation's oil company, from the Venezuelan people. Bolton has said, "We could have American companies produce the oil in Venezuela." Meanwhile, President Trump started calling Cuba, Nicaragua, and Venezuela the troika of tyranny. The Maduro government sought to withdraw its $1 billion worth of gold reserves held in the Bank of England. They were denied their own money due to increasing sanctions. Some suggest this as an act of financial piracy, whereas Juan Guaido has requested the money to be held so as not to be absconded by a kleptocracy and not to pay for human rights abuses, murder, torture, and mass arrests in Venezuela. Meanwhile, it is rumored that Maduro will give Russia all mining gold rights in Venezuela to pay their debt, which will turn rainforests into wastelands only to remove nominal amounts of gold. Because Venezuela has large gold holdings, it is also rumored that Russia has airlifted all the nation's reserve of gold bullion to Moscow for debt payments and safekeeping away from Washington's hands. Now, I must warn you, those are only rumors. And the reason why I bring up rumors and the fact of the gold not being released by the Bank of England is because the press wants us to keep our eye on the gold ball. Yet there are so many other issues at hand we must address. There are both Chavista pro-Maduro marches and pro-Guaido marches occurring regularly. Sporadic violence is reported regularly in Caracas, the capital, and gunfire can be heard in the night. Russia, China, Nicaragua, the State of Palestine, Trinidad, Tobago, and Bolivia have given their support for Maduro, countering the large and powerful international support for Guaido. Guaido is reported as originally participating in the Popular Will movement and party, which has been accused of decapitations. And there are photos of Guaido wearing battle gear with these people, according to the Greystone Project found online. Guaido is appealing to Article 233 in the Venezuelan Constitution, where he would be the legitimate leader should a power vacuum occur in the presidency. Maduro was elected and sworn in on January 10, 2019, but Juan Guaido states that this was an illegitimate election due to incessant election fraud of banning opposition candidates, ballot box stuffing, and counting irregularities. As well, the opposition boycotted the entire Maduro election because of these mentioned accusations they hurled at the election before its occurrence. They boycotted the elections by choice, and this seems to forge Guaido's basis for then claiming electoral illegitimacy. Juan Guaido's party is the majority party of the National Assembly, which then voted to disqualify the elections they boycotted and gave their complete support to the House Speaker Juan Guaido in accordance to their interpretation of the Constitution. In 2012, former U.S. President and Nobel Prize winner Jimmy Carter had declared that Venezuela's electoral system is the best in the world. Large numbers of Venezuelans have migrated to Ecuador as refugees seeking safety from the deteriorating situation in Venezuela. These Venezuelan migrants are suffering xenophobic attacks from indigenous Ecuadorians regularly. Meanwhile, the Attorney General of Venezuela asked the Supreme Court to bar Juan Guaido from leaving the country as the United States transferred all Venezuelan bank accounts into Juan Guaido's hands. Then, to top it all off, Elliot Abrams, a known hawk whose support funded alleged genocide campaigns and is now appointed as the point person on Venezuela. What will happen to these Venezuelan refugees in Ecuador if Venezuela sinks into civil war? Will the U.S. invade Venezuela? Will Russian-U.S. conflict occur in Venezuela? Are we returning to a Cold War in Central and South America between communists and capitalists again? Will neighboring countries to Venezuela join the growing conflict in a regional war? Will Venezuela's gold reserves be safe? Will the ecology of Venezuela be protected from rampant exploitation for both gold and oil? Will civilians be executed in sports arenas, which is so typical of Latin American history? Will the Venezuelan economy ever be fixed? Well, there we have some big questions, ladies and gentlemen. Questions that cannot be easily answered. And when there are questions we cannot answer, we turn to the cards simply to see what counsel they may offer. And as I've used already in both Venezuelan videos previously produced, I'm going to be using today the Fournier Poker Edition of Naipe Poker Español. This is a Baraja deck, and Baraja cards are used throughout Central and South America and throughout the Philippines. And this is what you would find at a gambling institution. But because this is a poker deck, it is not a traditional Baraja deck, which only goes ace through 9. This actually does ace through 10 like an American deck. And to complement this deck, because we're not simply dealing any longer with Venezuelan issues, which would be what this deck is for, and that is why in the past 2 videos on Venezuela, we have only used this deck. But now we're going international, because the Venezuelan issue is being addressed by the EU and other countries. So I've chosen to use this deck, which didn't come with a box, which is the Gassman deck. It's a very beautiful deck, and it only uses the higher arcane cards. And I thought that would be appropriate because in using the Baraja cards, there's no higher arcane cards. So we don't know what the spiritual things being offered by the universe are. We only know the mundane, down-to-earth factual events. These cards will give us insight into a more spiritual phenomenon surrounding all of this. So, time to shuffle up. We'll begin with the Gassman cards, and as you can see, it's a very thin deck. And that's because there's only 22 cards available here with this deck. And we just shuffle it a few times just to know that It's not in any particular order, and we'll cut the deck. And the same we'll do for these poker baraja cards put out by a French card company. And these are small enough that I can actually do them sideways. Some cards are so big they can only be done lengthwise. And just to let you all know, this is the proper way to shuffle all tarot cards. They are not meant to be bridge shuffled. That's only for plastic playing cards. Because these cards are much more fragile and they have, we don't want to scratch them and we don't want to bend them. And the card stock is not always as good as plastic playing cards for that kind of intensive bridge shuffling, or what is called riffle shuffling. Well, I'm going to pull these cards to the side so we can make room for our spread. And let us begin with the baraja cards. The first card is a good card. I'm so glad to see that. I'm very pleased. It is in this case, it's the Jack of Cups. And the second card is, we're dealing with some cups here today. The Three of Cups. It's very funny how cards work. People do get straight flushes and things where you have many cards of the same suit. It happens. It's how cards are dealt at times. And the third one, is the Ten of Swords. One of the worst sword cards there is. Sorry to see that one. And for the Gassman card, we are given La Papesse. Now, this is a traditional deck. As you can tell, it's an Austrian deck. I like the colorations of it, but it is a Marseille deck, and I am a Marseille reader primarily. So, what do these cards portend? Well, the Jack of Cups is very much like the Valet de Coupe in the Marseille deck, and it represents some kind of an offering being made. And because it's in the sign of the cups, I'll be honest with you, I wouldn't discount the role of the Catholic Church. I know the Pope has been visiting Central America while all of this is erupting in Venezuela. And I wouldn't be surprised if a papal envoy isn't involved in presenting some kind of a truce or treaty, because among other things, the Catholic Church does usually represent peace when it's not representing war. And we have the Papesse at the top, which is not the Pope. And so it would be secret meetings. It would be out of the public view. So it's very possible that, a contingency of Vatican representatives are now discussing things between the two candidates and the people who are wealthy, who are involved, maybe some of the wealthy Catholic landlords of the region, and trying to muster up some kind of a peace treaty. And with the Three of Cups in the middle, this is the card that gives birth. And so what are they giving birth to with this treaty? And what this card explains, the Ten of Swords, is where warring factions fight so hard, both sides get depleted of resources and completely exhausted and unable to fight anymore. It's like fighting and fighting until you're down to your last bullet, and then even that's gone. And then fighting with knives until they're dull and lost. And then fighting with your hands until you can't do that anymore. And fighting until everybody falls asleep. They just can't fight anymore. And so what the cards portend at this point is that if the papacy is involved, and I think it is, and they may be using the same order of priests that have been involved in politics throughout the planet and whom the Pope is associated with. And if they send their Vatican envoy, they may give birth to the circumstances of co-mutual exhaustion, that a civil war will destroy the country, destroy the economy, destroy the infrastructure, destroy the buildings of private property, destroy the commerce, and will leave everybody utterly exhausted and depleted, which is perfect, because then Russia and America can waltz right in and take the gold and the oil. And so this is what's being conjured currently in the world arena. This is not an answer. The cards do not portend an answer. They only portend an offering. And I think it may not only be the Vatican. This could also be offerings from Russia, offerings from America, offerings from Israel. You know, this offering, this idea of some kind of treaty or some kind of covenant or some kind of agreement or contract, some kind of new constitution, some kind of ideology that they want to give birth to is only going to lead to co-mutual exhaustion in a civil war and conflict. In fact, it could even be the stipulations of conduct of war, because they're just outwardly discussing how to do war. And so the cards still are not good. They're better to the extent that the Catholic Church is involved, and they weren't mentioned before. And the cards are better to the extent that some offerings are being made. Offerings being made is an important thing because it shows that there can be dialogue. You know, everything can be sorted out with dialogue. Not a single bullet needs to be fired. Not a single person needs to die. And that's the real truth. But what we are facing is a destroyed economy, a destroyed environment, and a destroyed sociology, a destroyed region of Earth. And that's not going to benefit anyone. The short-term profits for large multinational corporations or the short-term profits of large nations is not going to benefit the planet. It's going to make a few people rich in the short term. And it's going to destroy rainforests, cause genocide, and leave a scar that will never be erased. So I don't think yet that a plan exists because of the presence of the Ten of Swords. But if the special envoy is using rhetorically the idea of destruction and exhaustion of resources as a method of getting both sides to negotiate, then that would be a successful stance. And whether it comes from the Pope or from another source, could be Israel, could be the EU, but if this envoy presents it accordingly, the significance of this dire situation could hit close to home and cause both sides to rethink what are they doing to their country and to the world.